Hey YouTube, JP Dillon. Welcome to part 2 of the Lloyds all-in-one stereo system repair. Today we're going to focus on the 8-track player. Most predominantly the flywheel's pretty fucking sticky. Excuse the French there. Motor turns freely, it's got a lot of belt goo and things like that, so we're going to free this up, put a belt on it, clean the head up and see how well it works. Hopefully we won't have to pull the preamp. For the most part, these things are pretty simple. We already know that the elevator works from the previous video, although I will clean the little switch contacts down there so that all the lights possibly work. So the first thing to know on this is that this belt goo is extremely toxic. It's degraded, it's gross, it literally is goo. It's disgusting. And this hasn't degraded to the point that it's really disgusting, but it will turn to tar eventually. And the best way to clean this, depending on the composition of the urethane, is either Windex or denatured alcohol. You can also use 99% isopropanol or better, but really it just comes down to scraping everything off and cleaning it up. See if I can get a better close-up here of this. Or maybe some light, and that helps a little bit. So typically what I do, it helps that this is frozen so I can actually clean it off, is I'll just take an X-Acto and I'll clean it off. And this is like really sticky, and you can see here as I'm removing it the residue that's left. So our first task is going to be cleaning this off, removing all of this. Same with the motor over there, just getting this pulley clean. Another thing you have to watch out for, this hasn't happened on this one, but oftentimes the belt goo will become so corrosive. There we go. Let's remove it here. The process has begun. See that green stuff there? It's attacking the brass. There's a chemical reaction that's taking place that's attacking the brass, and if that's allowed to persist too long, it will actually eat away at the brass, and it will cause a change in the pulley diameter in those spots, which will induce just a ton of wow and flutter. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and clean this off. You've kind of seen an example, and then from there we'll see about breaking this guy loose. Alright, so here things are cleaned up. Got the motor pulley cleaned up and the flywheel cleaned up. So now we need to see about freeing up this flywheel. Now, one thing I noticed about this is they've got a pin, a dowel pin, that's driven in as a keeper to keep you from pulling the flywheel out. And that's crushed and it's just kind of in there. So I don't see any way easily of pulling the bearing out and dealing with it. However, there is another solution, and that's spraying something to degrease this thing and then getting some new oil in it. Now, if you don't want to use scary solvent degreasers, believe it or not, an excellent degreaser is deoxit fader lube. Why? Well, because it has a great degreasing solvent in it, and it has a very fine lubricant, and it's pressurized so you can flush it out. Now, I'm not a fan of this trigger style nozzle, and they have older nozzles with the old aerosol caps on them, but for the most part this actually works pretty well at unsticking stubborn stuff like this. And in fact, we get down in here and let me turn on the light so we can see what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and shoot a bunch of this into this bearing here. There's on the top, and there's on the bottom, and we're just going to let that sit for the tiniest little bit of time, and already it's starting to free it up. That was fast. Look at that, free spinning. Boom. So we can continue to flush this out, flush the grease out with this. And then we'll just, with it all flushed out, We'll dry the excess and then put some turbine oil in there or something like that. You can see that just does a marvelous job of freeing up sticky grease. So I'm going to wait a little bit, clean up the rest of this, and then we'll oil it up. Okay, so now that we got it all cleaned out, I've also cleaned the capstan shaft here. You can see this spins very nicely, nice and free. And the next thing I'm going to do is take an oiler syringe and just go in here to the top bearing, dribble a little bit of oil in there, not too much, and then on the bottom bearing, just a little bit, because you don't want to get oil on your capstan. And that should be good enough to sustain operation smoothly. I'm also going to get in here with a Q-tip and clean off that head best possible. And also you want to clean the little track changing sensors there. You can see they've got a bunch of oxide and gunk on them, so we're going to do that too. And then we'll size it up for a belt, and then we'll see how it plays. Another problem you run into on occasion is the insulative screws, if they're used, to hold the track change sensor together. And these are two plastic screws, and they're fatiguing. So if that's the case, what will happen is half of the sensor will break off, and there'll be 12 volts that could just fly around in midair or short against the chassis there, which would be bad. So since these screws are tired and worn out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a very thin layer of epoxy between the two plates to hold them together, so that there's very little probability that they will come apart and cause the sensor array to come apart and short out against something. So just mix up a little 5-minute epoxy. Avoid getting it towards the front here. Just stay on the plates and on the mounting surface, and you should be okay in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll size up a belt for it. Alright, so the next thing is really belt selection. And you can do it one of two ways. One way is to wrap a piece of string around the pulleys and then measure that string and subtract maybe about 5 to 8% worth of stretch. And on an 8-track, you're going to want a belt that's maybe 6 to 8 mils thick, maybe a millimeter thick at most. That's pushing it. And just judging by this size of this flywheel, which is about 4 inches, about maybe a ½ an inch worth of flywheel there, and the distance between the two, I'm going to say it's roughly about a 10.5, 11-inch belt. But I've got a whole bunch to try, so we're going to figure out which ones really work on this. Alright, so the first up is a 10.7-inch belt, and I can tell already just by looking at this is going to be a little bit short. Bear with me as I try to get it around the pulley here. Just holding the camera. Dee-dee-dee-dee. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at with that. Let me just get it around the pulley so I can show you. So around the pulley, this is about where it comes to, with about 5% stretch. So a 10.7 is no good. It's probably going to be a little more like an 11.8 or a 12. So let's go to that size. Alright, so here's an inch bigger at 11.7. And this is going to be perfect. Because with zero stretch, the apex, my finger, which is about the same width, the apex of the belt with no stretch comes right to the center of the pulley. It's about what you want, because you're going to get a little tiny bit of stretch here, and that works great. It's still very flexible, still a lot of stretch left, so it's not going to put a lot of lateral stress on this bearing, which would be a bad thing. And the phone's going to ring.
Call from 61951.
So anyway, we're going to test this now and figure out what it's capable of now that we've got a belt on it. Alright. Oops. Keep bumping the camera there. Alright, sound check. Alright, let's go get the cartridge and shove it in. Woohoo! That's going to give me a copyright strike. Fidelity on that head's pretty good. Cool. So that's working bitchin'. One thing I noticed that the little light doesn't come on. Oh, there it goes. The switch was just dirty. Awesome. Alright, so this thing's happy. So both now the 8-track and the rest of the receiver are working. So really, let's get it apart. And let's clean all of the dead moth and everything out. That's kind of gross. I'm guessing that if we pull the knobs off, there's probably some perimeter screws to take off. And then we can worry about cleaning it up. Maybe putting some lights behind here again. That tuning knob's stubborn. There we go. Alright, so knobs are off. Let's see how this thing's attached. Let's take my plugs off so I don't break off the RCA jacks. That would be great. Let's see. How do they do this? It looks like from the rear. Yeah, so you've got a couple nuts there. 1, 2. One there and a screw there, and then we can get the faceplate off. So let's get to it. Turns out this was like way more complicated than it needed to be. The 8-track was held to the front panel, and the radio chassis, which is separate, is held to the front panel. So once you find that you loosen the radio chassis, the 8-track's still holding everything in place. So I had to release the 8-track mounts here and release all 4 of the mounts there, but that gets it so that we have access to here. We can clean out our little dead moth friend over there, clean the glass and everything behind this. This also gives us access to our dial lamps here and here, so we can change those out. And I started to loosen the screws on here, and they got really loose really fast, and there's a little fracture here in the plastic. So I don't want to risk breaking that plastic. I'm just going to leave that alone. If it's a little dusty, oh well. But really I just want to clean this up because this is gross. So it'll just be Windex to clean it all up, brush to get the dead moth out. And I'm assuming that there's probably 12 volt lamps there, or 6 volt. Don't really know until I get it apart and test some voltages. Shouldn't be that hard. But really, accessing it, you have to do it from the front. If we peel the tape away here, we can see that the lamps are just kicking it in this little plastic holder. So one screw removes that, pull the lamps out, replace them. Doesn't look like fun, but got to do it. So I'm going to clean this up. We're going to see about getting some lamps in there, and then sheesh, clean this thing up, button it, and this part of it, the repair's done. Alright, so the dial lamps are in. You can see them turn on and off here on both sides. It's hard to see in this lit room, but they illuminate it fairly well in the dark. I've cleaned up the front panel behind the glass. I still need to get some goo gone and get the sticker residue out of here. But the 8-track works, radio works and all that. If you're curious as to what lamps worked, I used these 6.3 volt 40 milliampere bi-pin style lamps. You can get these pretty much anywhere, eBay, Dojo, etc. There was a lack of slack, so it was a little bit of a chore to get them changed out, but otherwise it worked nicely. So I'm going to button this back up, and the next segment will be working on the record changer. And then once the record changer is done, then we can put it all together with the speakers and see how it plays. So thanks for watching this episode of the video. More stuff to come soon.